Hello YouTube, and welcome to my channel. I've recently watched the debate between Godless Engineer and the Distributist, as well as the Distributist follow-up video. Links to both their channels and those two videos are in the description. Within the first 15 minutes of the debate, it was clear that the interlocutors were having two different discussions. Godless Engineer did not seem interested in discussing whether theistic belief is true or not. Apparently, that question needed no further inquiry. In his opening statement, he identified his claim as, roughly, religion is a net negative for society. He appeared to vary the strength of this claim throughout the debate, at times arguing that religion is perhaps the cause of all the world's ills, at other times saying that religion is nothing more than an outdated way of organizing society and should be replaced, presumably by something like secular humanism. The Distributist appeared to be much more interested in determining what his opponent found intrinsically wrong with religion. That is, the Distributist appeared to want to know what it is about religion that his interlocutor believed made it detrimental to society. Godless Engineer didn't apparently care about this mechanism, except to make some point about dogmatism, which went lightly attacked and even more lightly defended. From the discussion, it was clear that the Distributist was better prepared for the debate, with a greater historical knowledge to draw upon, a better familiarity with the series of moves in the various arguments, and an assertive style that prevented Godless Engineer from hiding in the gray areas of the discussion. Does that mean the Distributist won the debate? I don't know if there's ever a good way of saying anyone won in these kinds of informal discussions. What became more and more clear throughout the discussion, however, and I think the Distributist nailed this in his follow-up video, is that for a more productive discussion to take place, we will need an agreed-upon set of definitions. In the hopes that such a discussion will take place, this is my proposal for a set of useful definitions for skepticism, spirituality, faith, theism, atheism, and religion. Now, I'm not going to make any justification for this set of definitions over any others. I'm sure I could if I were asked to. But since no other useful, mutually agreed upon set of definitions has been proposed, I'm comfortable just letting this one stand on its own for now. After putting forth these definitions, I'm going to tackle the question, is communism a religion? I want to begin with skepticism because it will follow logically to begin there. Now, to be a skeptic seems to require that one be a methodological skeptic like Descartes, or that one be skeptical about something in particular. Now, as much as some members of the so-called skeptic community might claim to practice some form of methodological skepticism, I think most of them would agree that not all of them do. No, if there is a single unifying thread between the skeptic community and something that differentiates it from spiritual people, it is a particular skepticism about what I'm going to call existential angst. I'm not tied to that term for the phenomenon I'm about to describe, but it is the least contentious one I could come up with. But feel free to call it what you want. Basically, existential angst refers to the belief that at the very core of our being as individuals and as members of the human species, there is something lacking that ought to be there. A privation, to use the philosophical term. And this lack can't be filled by anything in the natural world. Some Christians would refer to this phenomenon as the effect of original sin. The term I used is existential angst. Perhaps most properly, it could be called the spiritual dimension of human nature. Just as we have a physical, biological, psychological, and emotional dimension, all spiritual people believe that human beings have a spiritual dimension. Skeptics are skeptical about the existence of this spiritual dimension. Some may deny its existence as a matter of principle, others are simply looking for further evidence that it exists. Spirituality, on the other hand, is the belief in the existence of the spiritual dimension, this existential angst. In this group of spiritual people, we can include all polytheists, monotheists, pantheists, panentheists, witches, Satanists, believers in ghosts, and even those people who wake up at 6 a.m. on the weekend to go to yoga class in order to open up their chakras. It's a pretty big tent. Basically, anyone who believes that there's some facet or dimension of human existence that's outside the explanatory power of the natural sciences can be called spiritual. This would even include people who have some vague belief in a higher power or are spiritual but not religious, but don't have any interest in exploring beyond that. Now, a smaller set of individuals can be called people of faith. To have faith means to have faith in something. A person of faith is someone who has a system of beliefs about what the spiritual dimension of a human being is, looks like, how it works, or how to interact with it. It is a diagnosis of what the existential angst of humanity is. Someone who believes in ghosts, like I said, is a spiritual person, but I don't think just believing in ghosts makes one a person of faith. To say, there are these things, I call them ghosts, is simply assigning a name to the spiritual dimension of the human person. A faith requires something more than a name. Now, if that same person were to then say, this is why some people who die come back as ghosts and others don't, or this is what I believe a ghost is, this is how to get rid of ghosts, and this is how to prevent yourself from becoming one when you die, then I would say he's got a faith. Someone who just believes in chakras doesn't have a faith, but the minute they ask and answer the question, why are chakras important and how do they work, that's when they cross that threshold. Now, if skepticism is a skepticism about the existence of existential angst, spirituality is a recognition that it exists, and faith is a diagnosis of what it is, then religion is the attempt to cure it. A religion isn't just a series of beliefs, but also a set of ethical and liturgical practices that men use to try to get in contact with their spiritual dimension. As a Catholic, I go to Mass because I believe it allows me to interact with my spiritual dimension and helps me move past my existential angst. Now, the reason why I think it does that is because I believe that Jesus Christ is God and the Mass was instituted by God as the perfect form of worship, that Jesus is present in the Eucharist, and that the Mass is efficacious for the forgiveness of sin. But at the end of the day, none of that would matter without the prior belief in a spiritual dimension of mankind. That having been addressed, it's clear that theism is a spiritual belief in at least one God, and that there can be theistic faiths and theistic religions. Now, you do run into philosophical problems if you spend too much time thinking about the category of theism. For example, are polytheistic gods comparable to what the Abrahamic religions call a god? Are they not mere superhuman entities? What really distinguishes a pantheist or panentheist from a nature worshipper? But at the end of the day, as interesting as those questions are, I don't think they are helpful to our definitional problems. I'm willing to accept these as theistic beliefs on the grounds that the believers call the things they believe in gods, even if further investigation might show that they are not. Atheism, strictly speaking, is therefore a disbelief in theism. It's a lack of belief in a god or the idea that the spiritual dimension of mankind, if it exists, requires a god. Not all atheists are skeptics. One can believe in the spiritual dimension of man and not believe in God. That would be the position of Buddhists. Of course, there are many atheists who are skeptics, and their disbelief in theistic solutions as a cure for existential angst derives from their disbelief in existential angst in the first place. You don't need a cure if there is no disease. So, in summary, skeptics are skeptical of existential angst. They either believe there is nothing wrong with humanity as it currently exists, or if there is something wrong with it, it's resolvable through non-spiritual means. Spiritual people recognize the existence of existential angst, people of faith have defined the cause of existential angst, and religious people are attempting to treat it. Theism is a set of possible cures, and atheism is a skepticism in that set. Now, having presented these definitions, I would like to examine the relationship between skepticism and communism. I believe Godless Engineer's definition of communism as a specific type of social and economic system, if perhaps vague, works for our purposes. Now, communists seem to believe that communism is necessary to save people, particularly the poor and laborers, from exploitation, or more precisely, the alienation of their labor. The problems of mankind, from at least the Marxist perspective, and he's the only communist I've read in depth, are material. In other words, Marx did believe that mankind was plagued by an angst. He just didn't think it was an existential angst. He knew there was a problem, it just wasn't a spiritual problem. Marxism is proposing a material solution for what spiritual people believe is a spiritual problem. Marxism isn't the only manifestation like this, by the way. I would argue certain forms of racialism fit this bill as well. Whenever someone makes the claim that they are impoverished because they feel cut off from their ancestors, or whenever the ills of mankind are reduced to a biological level, I think we have the same occurrence. In other words, Marxism and racialism are not mere skepticism. They are skeptics' attempt to diagnose the symptoms of existential angst as something other than existential. In other words, they are pseudo-spiritualisms. By that definition, all Marxists and other pseudo-spiritual people are skeptics and atheists, but not all skeptics and atheists are pseudo-spiritual. A skeptic or atheist that simply denies that mankind is angsty would be a mere skeptic. Such a person would essentially be saying, I'm okay, you're okay, even if we don't feel okay, which is a perfectly rational position to hold. Now, what can and should be asked of the skeptic is, given that many people don't believe they are okay, how will atheists prevent the rise of pseudo-religions in societies where they hold religion at bay? In other words, the vast majority of mankind have felt the need for religion in much the same way as they have felt the need for nutritious food. Once the skeptic has taken the nutritious food away from all these people, how will they prevent the people from turning to junk food, like Marxism or racialism? If the Distributist or Godless Engineer or anyone else would like to come on this channel to discuss that question, I would be delighted to go further in the discussion. If you enjoyed this video, I invite you to subscribe and become one of my patrons on Patreon. Until next time, I'm Benedict the 17th. Go with God.